He had 17 seconds to make a decision that would either save 10,000 American soldiers or start a war that nobody could stop. His hands were shaking. His radio was dead. And the man standing 50 feet away, shaking hands with the enemy, was the same man who had pinned a medal on his chest just 3 weeks ago. This is the story of Sergeant Marcus Cole, the soldier they buried in classified files, the hero they tried to erase from every record, and the one man who walked into the heart of enemy territory alone and came back with something nobody expected. Stay with us. This story will change the way you think about courage, betrayal, and what it really means to serve your country. And before we begin, if you love your mom and dad, hit that subscribe button right now and show them some love. They raised someone with a heart strong enough to appreciate real stories like this one. The night was the kind of dark that swallows everything whole. No stars. No moon. Just a thick, pressing blackness that sat over the mountains like a held breath. The temperature had dropped to near freezing, and the wind moved through the pine trees like a warning that nobody had the good sense to listen to. Sergeant Marcus Cole had been lying flat against the cold earth for 47 minutes. His face pressed into dead leaves and frozen dirt. His breathing so controlled and deliberate that even the air around him seemed unaware that a human being was there. He had trained for this. He had trained for moments exactly like this one, where everything depended on stillness, on patience, on the ability to shut down every human instinct that screams to move, to run, to breathe louder than a whisper. Marcus Cole was 34 years old, born in a small town outside of Columbus, Ohio, the kind of place where people worked hard, talked straight, and trusted each other because they had to. His father had served in the military before him. His grandfather before that. Service was not a choice in the Cole family. It was something that passed through the blood like a gene, like eye color, like the stubborn set of the jaw that every Cole man carried as naturally as his own name. Marcus had enlisted at 18, deployed at 20, and by 30 he had become something that the military rarely produces and almost never acknowledges publicly, a soldier who was equally dangerous with a weapon in his hands or a thought in his head. His official rank was sergeant. His actual role was something different. For 3 years, Marcus Cole had been operating deep undercover, inside one of the most dangerous enemy organizations operating in the region. He knew their commanders by their first names. He had eaten meals with men who would have killed him without hesitation if they had known the truth. He had memorized patrol schedules, weapon caches, communication frequencies, and the faces of every major figure in their chain of command. He had done things in those 3 years that kept him awake at night, things that he told himself were necessary, things that he knew would never appear in any official report because the people who authorized them needed clean hands and selective memory. But tonight was different. Tonight was the night that all 3 years of silence, patience, and sacrifice were supposed to pay off. The mission was straightforward on paper. Marcus had managed to steal an enemy communication device. Not just any device, but a modified satellite transmitter that contained encoded coordinates for the largest weapons depot the enemy had constructed in the entire region. Intelligence analysts back at command had spent 6 months trying to locate that depot. It held enough munitions to sustain enemy operations for the next 4 years. Destroying it would not end the conflict, but it would break the enemy's operational backbone at the worst possible time for them, and the best possible time for Allied forces. The mission was to reach the transmission tower located 12 kilometers east, upload the coordinates through a secure channel, and get out before sunrise. What the mission briefing had not accounted for was the ambush. Marcus and his 4-man squad had been moving through the eastern ridge when the first shot cracked through the darkness. It was a sharp, clean sound that split the night in half and turned everything that came after it into chaos. Within 90 seconds, 3 of his teammates were down. The 4th, a young specialist named Danny Reeves from Memphis, Tennessee, had grabbed Marcus by the arm and pushed him behind a rock formation before taking a round in the shoulder that spun him hard to the ground. Marcus had looked at Danny for one long terrible second. The kid was 19 years old, had photographs of his mother and his dog taped inside his helmet, and Danny had looked back at him with clear eyes and said, "Go." Just that one word. Go. Marcus went. He had been running, crawling, and hiding for the past 2 hours since that moment. The stolen device was secured inside a waterproof pouch strapped to his chest, pressed against his heartbeat like a second heartbeat of its own. His primary radio had been destroyed in the ambush. His backup communication unit had a cracked circuit board, and could receive signals but could not transmit. He was alone, 12 kilometers from his objective, in territory where every shadow could be an enemy and every sound could be his last. What kept him moving was not bravado. It was not the kind of reckless courage that gets soldiers killed and earns them posthumous honors they would have traded for one more ordinary Tuesday back home. What kept Marcus Cole moving through that frozen darkness was something quieter and more durable than courage. It was the weight of what he was carrying. Not just the device, but the knowledge of what would happen if he did not complete this mission. He had seen the troop movement reports. He knew that Allied forces were planning a major push at dawn, moving through exactly the kind of terrain where that weapons depot could turn a difficult fight into an absolute massacre. 10,000 soldiers. Fathers, sons, husbands. Kids like Danny Reeves with photographs of their mothers taped inside their helmets. He kept moving. The forest gave way to a narrow valley floor about 4 kilometers from the transmission tower. Marcus had memorized the terrain maps well enough to know that crossing the valley in the open was suicide. Enemy patrols moved through it every 40 minutes in a rotating pattern he had studied back at base. The solution was to move along the western tree line, staying within the shadows of the pines, using the natural elevation changes to stay below the sight lines of any patrols moving on the valley floor. It would add 20 minutes to his approach. 20 minutes was a manageable cost. He had been moving along that tree line for about 12 minutes when he heard the voices. There were 2 of them, speaking in low tones about 30 meters ahead of him. He stopped immediately, slowed his breathing, and pressed himself against the nearest tree trunk. The voices were moving in his direction. He had maybe 40 seconds before they would be on top of his position. There was no time to go around them. There was very little ground cover between his current position and the next significant cluster of trees. He made a calculation that he would not have been able to explain in words, a calculation that lived in the body rather than the mind, built from thousands of hours of training and experience, and he went flat to the ground, pressing himself into a shallow depression at the base of the tree, pulling his dark outer layer over his head and becoming, as completely as a human being can, part of the forest floor. The 2 soldiers passed 4 feet from his left shoulder. One of them was smoking. The smell of the tobacco was shockingly ordinary in that extraordinary moment, and Marcus found himself thinking of his father sitting on the back porch on summer evenings, the same smell drifting through the screen door, the sound of a baseball game on the radio inside. He held that memory like a stone in his fist until the footsteps faded and the voices dissolved back into the general silence of the night. He waited 3 more minutes. Then he moved. The transmission tower came into view at exactly 0213 hours. It was a steel structure about 40 feet high, mounted on a concrete platform at the edge of a small military outpost. The outpost was not supposed to be heavily staffed at this hour according to the intelligence Marcus had memorized. There should have been 2 perimeter guards rotating on a 20-minute cycle, 1 communications officer inside the main building, and a secondary entrance on the northern face that could be accessed using a 6-digit code Marcus had obtained through his undercover work 8 months earlier. Should have been. What Marcus actually saw when he reached the edge of the tree line and looked through the scope of his rifle at the outpost stopped everything inside him. His breathing, his heartbeat, his ability to process what his own eyes were showing him. There were 2 men standing inside the communications building. The lights were on, which alone violated standard nighttime protocol, and should have set off alarm bells in every intelligence report for the past month. But it was not the lights that stopped Marcus cold. It was the men themselves. One of them was wearing enemy uniform. That was expected. That was the entire reason this outpost was a target. The other man was wearing Allied uniform, and Marcus recognized him immediately. General Raymond Harmon, 58 years old, decorated veteran, the man who had stood in front of Marcus's unit 3 weeks ago, and delivered a speech about sacrifice and duty, and the unbreakable bond between soldiers that Marcus had found genuinely moving at the time. The man who had personally pinned a commendation medal on Marcus's chest, and called him the finest example of what the Allied military could produce. General Raymond Harmon was standing inside an enemy communications outpost in the middle of the night, shaking hands with an enemy general, and the body language of both men suggested this was not the first time they had done so. Marcus stayed very still. His mind moved fast, cycling through possibilities with the cold efficiency of a man who had spent years operating in situations where misreading a situation meant death. He considered the possibility that Harmon was running his own undercover operation. He rejected it within seconds. No sanctioned operation would involve the commanding general meeting personally in a live enemy facility. He considered the possibility that Harmon was being coerced. He rejected that too. The handshake was relaxed. The body language was collegial. These were two men with an established relationship conducting a routine meeting. General Harmon was a traitor. And in that moment, Marcus Cole understood something that reframed every event of the past 6 months with brutal clarity. The ambush on the eastern ridge had not been a random encounter. The patrol pattern had changed in a way that should have required updated intelligence to predict. Someone had told the enemy exactly where his squad would be moving and at what time. Someone with access to operational planning at the highest level. The 4-man squad that had gone into that forest tonight had been sent there to be eliminated. And the mission they were carrying, the device in Marcus's chest pouch, was supposed to end at the bottom of a mountain, undiscovered, buried under leaves and silence. Danny Reeves had not been hit by a random enemy patrol. Danny Reeves had been set up. Marcus felt something move through him that was not quite rage and not quite grief but lived in the neighborhood of both. He breathed through it the way he had been trained to breathe through everything. Steadily, deliberately, making it useful instead of destructive. He had a decision to make and he had to make it fast. Option 1 was to abort. Pull back, find an alternate communication route, report what he had seen through proper channels. Clean, safe, and completely useless because the proper channels led straight back to General Harmon and everyone who operated under his command. Option 2 was to proceed with the original mission, upload the coordinates and destroy the depot. But if he used the transmission tower inside that outpost, Harmon would know within minutes that someone had accessed it. He would know the device had not been destroyed. He would know that someone was alive who had seen something they were never meant to see. Marcus would not make it out of that forest. He sat with those two options for exactly 45 seconds. Then he thought of a third. The device in his chest pouch had been designed for a single encrypted upload to a single secure channel. But Marcus had spent 3 years inside enemy communications infrastructure, and he knew something that the Allied intelligence community had apparently not yet figured out. The enemy's own internal network operated on a series of overlapping frequencies that, under the right conditions, could be used to broadcast simultaneously across multiple channels. Every Allied command post in the region monitored those frequencies as part of standard signals intelligence protocol. If Marcus could modify the upload sequence, not to a single secure channel, but to a broad simultaneous broadcast across every frequency the enemy network used, the coordinates would not reach one command post. They would reach every command post simultaneously. And more importantly, the broadcast would carry source data, authentication signatures that would include the access logs from the transmission tower, the timestamp, and the identity of the communication officer whose credentials Marcus was planning to use. Every Allied signals intelligence officer in the region would see simultaneously that an Allied transmission had been sent from inside an enemy facility, using enemy credentials at 0200 hours on a night, when General Harmon's official location was logged as Allied headquarters 40 kilometers away. It would not just destroy the depot, it would expose the traitor. The modification to the upload sequence took 11 minutes. Marcus's hands were steadier than they had any right to be. He worked by feel in the darkness, guided by technical knowledge that had been drilled into him over hundreds of hours of communications training, making micro-adjustments to the device's broadcast configuration while lying flat in the underbrush 40 meters from an enemy outpost where one of the most senior officers in the Allied military was having a quiet midnight meeting with the man responsible for the deaths of thousands. At 0231 hours, Marcus Cole pressed the transmission button. What happened in the next 4 minutes was something that he would spend the rest of his life being unable to fully describe to people who had not been there. He saw the lights inside the communications building flicker as the tower above it suddenly surged with unauthorized broadcast activity. He saw the enemy general look up from whatever he had been examining on the table between them. He saw General Harmon's face change, not with confusion, but with a specific, cold recognition that confirmed everything. Harmon knew what a simultaneous multi-frequency broadcast from this location meant. He understood immediately. And for one fraction of a second, illuminated by the window light of a building, he should never have been inside. Raymond Harmon looked directly out toward the tree line. Marcus did not move. Harmon could not see him. The darkness was too complete. But the eye contact, imagined or real, lasted long enough for Marcus to feel it in his chest like a physical thing. Then the distant sound began. It started as a low rumble that Marcus felt in the ground before he heard it in the air. A deep subsonic vibration that rolled up through the earth and into his bones. The weapons depot was 40 kilometers to the northeast. The Allied strike aircraft that had been holding in a standby pattern for the past 6 hours, waiting for exactly these coordinates, had received the broadcast simultaneously with every other command post in the region. They had not waited for confirmation or clarification. The coordinates were authenticated. The mission was clear. They had moved immediately. The explosion, when it came, lit the northern horizon like a second sunrise. A massive orange and white bloom of fire that rose above the mountain line and hung there, painting the clouds from beneath in shades of amber and red, rolling outward in a slow cathedral of smoke and heat that Marcus watched from his position in the underbrush with something that was too exhausted and too complicated to be called triumph but was in the neighborhood of it. Behind him, inside the outpost, he could hear voices rising in alarm. He could hear radio traffic exploding across every frequency. He could hear the distant sound of vehicles starting and helicopter rotors beginning to turn. The enemy was scrambling. Their largest operational asset was gone. Their communications were flooded with a broadcast that every Allied intelligence officer in the region was now analyzing in real time, pulling the authentication logs, cross-referencing the timestamps, making the connections that could not be unmade. Marcus Cole was already gone. He moved through the forest for the next 3 hours with the careful, unhurried efficiency of a man who has completed the hardest part of a very hard job. He knew the terrain. He knew the patrol patterns. He had stored enough contingency routes in his memory to navigate out of that valley 6 different ways, and he took the 7th, a route that did not exist in any map he had memorized, that he constructed in real time from the natural features of the landscape, a route that no one who did not have his specific combination of skills and experience could have followed or anticipated. At 0612 hours, as the first genuine light of morning began to thin the darkness in the east, Marcus Cole walked out of the forest onto a gravel road 3 kilometers from a small Allied forward operating base. He was carrying nothing except the empty device, now transmitting nothing, its mission complete. He had 3 shallow cuts on his forearms from moving through dense underbrush. His boots were soaked through. He had not eaten in 19 hours. He sat down on the gravel road and waited. The first vehicle to come down that road was a supply truck driven by a corporal who was 22 years old, and had been awake all night listening to the radio traffic about what had happened at the depot. The corporal stopped the truck, looked at the man sitting alone on the gravel road in the early morning light, and asked him if he needed help. Marcus Cole said yes. What happened after that moved quickly. The forward operating base became aware within minutes that the soldier who had walked out of the forest was carrying information about the night's events that went far beyond the destruction of the depot. The signals intelligence reports had already begun arriving at Allied command posts across the region, and the authentication logs from the tower transmission had already been flagged by 3 separate intelligence analysts, who had independently reached the same conclusion. General Raymond Harmon was taken into custody at Allied headquarters at 0748 hours. He was escorted out of his command office by 2 military police officers who had been sent by a general from a different command structure entirely, one that Harmon had no authority over and no warning about. He did not resist. The reports that came back later described him as very calm. The kind of calm that comes not from innocence but from the exhausted relief of a man who has been carrying a secret for a very long time, and has finally been relieved of the burden of maintaining it. Danny Reeves survived. The round that hit his shoulder had missed everything vital, and a rescue team had reached him and the other wounded members of the squad within 2 hours of the ambush. He spent 3 weeks in a military hospital and went home to Memphis with a scar on his shoulder, and a story he would spend the rest of his life telling only to people he trusted completely. As for Marcus Cole, his official after-action report was filed under a classification level so high that fewer than 12 people in the entire Allied command structure had clearance to read it. His name did not appear in any press release. No ceremony was held. No medal was pinned to his chest by anyone whose hand he would later find himself not wanting to shake. The commendation that Harmon had given him 3 weeks earlier was quietly removed from the official record, Not because Marcus had done anything wrong, but because it served as an inconvenient reminder of a story that certain people needed to be much simpler than it actually was. Marcus Cole received a handwritten note from a general whose name has never been made public. The note contained 11 words. It said, "What you did cannot be properly acknowledged, but it will not be forgotten." He folded the note once, placed it in his breast pocket, and never mentioned it to anyone. There is a version of courage that gets parades and speeches and has its photograph taken. There is another version that moves through the dark alone, makes impossible decisions with incomplete information, carries the weight of other people's lives across frozen terrain in the middle of the night, and then walks out of the forest in the early morning and sits on a gravel road waiting for a supply truck. That second version does not always get acknowledged. It does not always get the ceremony or the medal or the moment where the crowd stands and the music swells and everyone understands what was sacrificed and what was saved. It often gets a classified report and a handwritten note and the knowledge, private and unverifiable and entirely its own, that when everything was on the line, it did not turn away. Sergeant Marcus Cole went home on a commercial flight 3 months later. He sat in a middle seat. The person next to him was reading a magazine. Nobody recognized him. Nobody knew that the man in the middle seat between a businessman and a college student had, 3 months earlier, prevented a massacre that would have changed the course of the war, exposed a traitor at the highest level of the Allied command, and done it all alone in the dark on a night when the only light came from an explosion of his own making 40 kilometers away. He fell asleep somewhere over the Midwest and dreamed of his father on the back porch with the baseball game on the radio, and the smell of tobacco drifting through the screen door. Some stories do not end with a bang. They end with a man sleeping in a middle seat, heading home, carrying everything inside him that will never appear in any record, and being, in the most complete and private sense of the word, at peace. If you love your mom and dad, hit that subscribe button right now and show them some love. They raised a real one, and real ones support stories that matter. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching this from? Drop your city and state in the comments right now. Let us know which part of the country is tuned in tonight. We read every single comment and we want to know you are out there.